In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor was overthrown by his own bodyguard, a barbarian mercenary Rome couldn't afford to pay. 300 years earlier, Rome controlled the Mediterranean world. The emperor's name was Romulus Augustulus. He was 14 years old. His bodyguard, Odoacer, didn't kill him. He just pensioned him off, gave him a villa in Campania, a comfortable retirement, because by September 476, the throne of Rome wasn't worth the blood it would take to claim it. The empire that had built the Colosseum, the Pantheon, aqueducts that still carry water today, that empire ended with a teenager getting a severance package from a mercenary who hadn't been paid in months. But that moment, it wasn't what you think. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians at the gates. It fell because of 5 specific decisions Roman leaders made over the previous 200 years. 5 choices that seemed reasonable at the time. 5 mistakes that hollowed out the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And every single one of those mistakes is being repeated right now. By us. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period historians call the Crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had 50 different emperors in 49 years. 26 were assassinated. Only 1 died of natural causes. During those same 49 years, the silver content in Roman currency dropped from 50% to 5%. The denarius, the coin that had been the dollar of the ancient world for 3 centuries, became worthless metal wrapped in a thin silver coating. By 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a desperate attempt to control inflation that had increased prices by 1,000% in a single generation. The edict listed maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services. It failed completely. Black markets exploded. Food disappeared from official markets. And here's the number that should make your stomach drop. In 235 AD, Rome's military was 90% Roman citizens. By 400 AD, it was less than 10%. The legions that defended the empire were almost entirely foreign mercenaries who fought for pay, not loyalty. Look at these numbers together. They tell you everything. They're symptoms of a pattern that starts with 5 specific mistakes, and every one of them has a modern equivalent that should terrify you. Over the next 18 minutes, you're going to see exactly how Rome destroyed itself from within. Not through weakness, but through choices that seemed practical, even necessary, to the people making them. We're going to walk through 5 fatal mistakes. Currency debasement that wiped out the middle class, outsourcing defense to mercenaries, wealth concentration that broke social cohesion, infrastructure collapse that strangled trade, and political gridlock that made reform impossible. One mistake created the conditions for the next. By the time they realized what was happening, they couldn't stop it. And by the time Roman leaders understood what was happening, the pattern had become irreversible. But here's what makes this story more than just a history lesson. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, faced the same pressures, made different choices, and survived for another 1,000 years. The question isn't whether empires fall. The question is whether the pattern can be broken before it's too late. And that answer depends on whether we can recognize what we're looking at. Let's start with money, because that's where Rome's unraveling began. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero needed cash. Rome was expensive. The palace he was building, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, was consuming the treasury. So Nero did something simple. He reduced the silver content in the denarius from 100% to 90%. 10%, barely noticeable. The coins looked the same, weighed almost the same, and suddenly, Nero had 10% more coins to spend. It worked. So his successors did it again, and again. By 218 AD, the denarius was 50% silver. By 268 AD, it was 5%. By 300 AD, Roman coins were essentially copper with a silver wash that rubbed off in your hand. This wasn't stupidity. Every emperor who debased the currency was trying to solve a real problem. Military pay, infrastructure, grain subsidies for Rome's million residents, all of it cost money the treasury didn't have, and raising taxes was politically impossible. The Senate wouldn't allow it. The army would revolt. So they printed money, ancient style. So what did Rome do? Exactly the wrong thing. Soldiers noticed their pay bought less food, so they demanded higher pay, which required more coins, which required more debasement, which made the coins worth less, a perfect death spiral. By 250 AD, a Roman soldier's annual salary could buy 1/20th of what it bought in 200 AD. In 50 years, the purchasing power of military pay dropped by 95%. The middle class, merchants, artisans, small landowners who formed the backbone of Roman society, got wiped out. Their savings became worthless. A lifetime of denarii saved for retirement couldn't buy a month's grain. So they did what people always do when currency collapses. They converted wealth into land, into goods, into anything tangible. The money economy began to break down. By 300 AD, large sections of the empire had reverted to barter. And here's where the second mistake enters. Because when Rome couldn't pay its soldiers in money that meant anything, it started paying them in something else: land, and permission to take what they needed from the provinces they were supposed to protect. The legions became predators. Roman soldiers stationed in Gaul or Spain or North Africa weren't defending those provinces anymore. They were extracting from them, requisitioning food, demanding bribes, operating protection rackets. In 238 AD, the governor of Africa, Gordian I, declared himself emperor specifically because the tax collectors and soldiers sent from Rome had made the province ungovernable. He lasted 36 days before being killed, but the message was clear. The empire was eating itself. And when soldiers become predators, empires start outsourcing defense to anyone who'll do it cheaper. Which brings us to the third mistake, the one that put a barbarian mercenary in position to overthrow that 14-year-old emperor. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens was killed along with 2/3 of his army. They were defeated by the Visigoths, not invaders from outside the empire, but refugees Rome had allowed to settle inside the borders just 2 years earlier. The Visigoths weren't trying to destroy Rome, they were running from the Huns. They'd begged for permission to cross the Danube, to settle in Thrace, to become part of the empire. Rome said yes, because Rome needed soldiers, and the Visigoths were warriors. The deal was simple. The Visigoths would provide military service. Rome would provide land and food. But Roman officials immediately began extorting the refugees, selling them dog meat at inflated prices, enslaving their children, treating them like a resource to exploit rather than allies to integrate. So the Visigoths revolted, and they won. At Adrianople, they killed an emperor and destroyed an army that Rome couldn't replace. Remember that question from the beginning? How does the greatest military power in history end up being overthrown by its own bodyguard? This is how. This is the exact moment when Rome lost the ability to defend itself with its own people. After Adrianople, Rome had no choice. It needed soldiers immediately. So it did what desperate powers always do. It hired mercenaries. Entire barbarian tribes were given federate status. They'd fight for Rome in exchange for land, gold, and autonomy. By 400 AD, the Roman military was a patchwork of Germanic warbands led by their own chiefs, paid in Roman gold, wearing Roman uniforms, but loyal only to whoever paid them. The Magister Militum, the supreme military commander, was almost always a barbarian. Stilicho was a Vandal, Ricimer was a Goth, Odoacer was a Scyrian. These men weren't stupid. They weren't primitive. Stilicho was arguably the most competent general Rome had in the 5th century. But his loyalty was conditional, transactional. And when Rome ran out of gold to pay him, his soldiers turned on each other. In 410 AD, Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome. Not because he hated Rome, he'd spent his entire career fighting for Rome. He sacked it because Rome owed him 3 years of back pay and refused to deliver. His soldiers were starving, so he took what he was owed. The sack of Rome lasted 3 days. It was the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years, and it happened because Rome couldn't pay its own army. But the real damage wasn't on the battlefield, it was back home. The reason Rome couldn't pay its army wasn't just currency collapse. It was the fourth mistake, the one that's hardest to see while it's happening. Between 250 and 400 AD, Rome stopped maintaining its infrastructure. The aqueducts that brought water to cities, the roads that connected provinces, the bridges that carried trade, the granaries that stored food against famine. In 220 AD, Rome had 250,000 miles of paved roads. By 400 AD, most of them were impassable. Bridges collapsed and weren't rebuilt. Aqueducts broke and weren't repaired. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's sewer system, one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world, filled with debris until sections of the city flooded with sewage every time it rained. Why? Because infrastructure maintenance doesn't win elections. It doesn't impress the mob. It doesn't secure an emperor's legacy. Building something new gets you a triumph and a monument. Fixing a road gets you nothing. And infrastructure collapse has a multiplier effect. When roads decay, trade decreases. When trade decreases, tax revenue drops. When tax revenue drops, you can't maintain the roads. Another death spiral. By 400 AD, grain shipments from North Africa to Rome, the logistical backbone that fed the capital, were taking twice as long and arriving half as often. Not because of barbarian raids, because the ports were silting up and nobody dredged them. Because the coastal roads were crumbling and nobody fixed them. Cities that had been connected for centuries became isolated. Provinces that had been economically integrated fragmented into self-sufficient units that didn't need the empire anymore. The Roman world was breaking into pieces, and the pieces were learning they were better off alone. And the fifth mistake made it impossible to fix any of the others: political gridlock.
The Roman Senate in the 5th century still existed, still met, still debated, but it had become completely disconnected from reality. While barbarian armies camped outside Rome's walls, the Senate argued about tax exemptions for aristocratic estates. While provinces begged for military support, senators debated the theological fine points of Christianity. In 408 AD, when Alaric first approached Rome demanding payment, the Senate spent weeks arguing about whether negotiating with barbarians would set a bad precedent. While they debated precedent, Alaric's army surrounded the city and cut off its food supply. The Senate had become a club for the ultra-wealthy, and the ultra-wealthy had insulated themselves from the consequences of imperial collapse. Senators owned vast estates that functioned as independent economic units. They had private armies, private food supplies. They didn't need the empire to function because they'd built their own miniature empires inside it, so they had no incentive to make the sacrifices necessary to save it. Every reform proposal died in committee. Every tax increase was blocked. Every attempt to reclaim public land from senatorial estates was defeated. And this is the pattern that connects all 5 mistakes. Each one made sense in isolation. Each one solved an immediate problem. But together, they created a system that couldn't reform itself even when everyone could see the collapse coming. In 1971, the United States ended the gold standard. The dollar, which had been backed by $35 per ounce of gold since 1944, became a fiat currency, backed by nothing but trust in the American government. It was a practical decision. The Vietnam War was expensive. Social programs were expensive, and the gold in Fort Knox was flowing to foreign creditors demanding payment. So President Nixon did what Emperor Nero had done 19 centuries earlier. He changed what money meant. Since 1971, the purchasing power of the dollar has declined by 86%. The same pattern. A dollar in 1971 bought what $7.14 buys today. But here's the number that should sound familiar. In 1971, the median American home cost $25,000, roughly 2.2 times the median household income.
In 2024, the median home costs $417,000, 7.8 times the median household income. The middle class is being hollowed out by currency debasement, just like Rome's. Not through silver content, but through quantitative easing, deficit spending, and money creation that benefits asset holders while destroying purchasing power for wage earners. Between 2020 and 2024, the United States increased its money supply by 40%. The Federal Reserve created more dollars in 4 years than existed in the entire American economy in 2008. Just like Rome, the people making these calls weren't idiots. They were trapped by circumstances they couldn't control. COVID relief, infrastructure spending, military budgets, all real needs, all requiring money the government didn't have. And just like Rome, the people who hold assets, real estate, stocks, land, have seen their wealth explode. While people who hold dollars, savings, wages, fixed incomes, have watched their purchasing power collapse. Now the second parallel. In 2024, the United States military is facing a recruitment crisis. The Army missed its recruitment goal by 25% in 2023. The Navy, Air Force, and Marines all fell short. For the first time since the draft ended in 1973, the American military cannot attract enough of its own citizens to fill its ranks. The solution? The same one Rome chose. In 2021, the United States began offering expedited citizenship to non-citizen recruits. As of 2024, approximately 8% of active-duty American military personnel are not U.S. citizens. This isn't a criticism of those service members. Many are more patriotic than native-born Americans. But it's the same pattern. When a society can't or won't defend itself, it outsources defense to people with less stake in its survival. And here's the part that should make you pause. The top 5 private military contractors, the modern version of Rome's Foederati, earned a combined $166 billion from the U.S. government in 2023. Warfare has become transactional, mercenary, just like Rome in 400 AD. Third parallel. In 2021, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave U.S. infrastructure a grade of C-. That's up from D+ in 2017, not because infrastructure improved, but because the grading scale was adjusted. 46% of American roads are in poor or mediocre condition. 1 in 3 bridges needs repair or replacement. Drinking water systems lose 6 billion gallons per day to leaking pipes. The electrical grid experiences 180% more major outages than it did in 23. The cost to bring American infrastructure to acceptable condition? $2.6 trillion. The amount allocated by Congress in the 2021 infrastructure bill? $550 billion over 10 years. 1/5 of what's needed. And just like Rome, the reason isn't lack of money, it's lack of political will. Because fixing a bridge doesn't win elections. Cutting a ribbon on a new project does. Fourth parallel. In 1980, the wealthiest 1% of Americans held 8% of the nation's wealth. In 2024, they hold 32%. The bottom 50% of Americans hold 2% of the nation's wealth, down from 4% in 1980. This is the same wealth concentration that broke Roman social cohesion. The same pattern where the ultra-wealthy insulate themselves from the systems that sustain society, then lose interest in maintaining those systems. In 2024, the top 25 American billionaires paid an average federal tax rate of 3.4%. Not because they're breaking the law, but because the tax code has been rewritten to favor asset appreciation over income, the same way Roman senators rewrote tax law to exempt their estates while small farmers paid crushing rates. And the fifth parallel. Since 2010, the United States Congress has passed an average of 150 laws per year. Between 1950 and 1970, it averaged 800 per year. The American government has become structurally incapable of addressing large-scale problems.
Climate infrastructure, immigration reform, tax restructuring, entitlement sustainability. Every major challenge faces partisan gridlock that makes meaningful legislation impossible. Just like Rome's Senate in 408 AD, debating precedent while barbarians surrounded the city. These aren't metaphors. These are the same 5 mistakes, playing out in the same sequence, producing the same results. Currency debasement, defense outsourcing, wealth concentration, infrastructure decay, political paralysis. And here's what Rome teaches us about where this leads. It doesn't end with a bang. It ends with a 14-year-old emperor getting a retirement package from a mercenary who wasn't paid enough to care anymore.
But remember what we said at the beginning. The Eastern Roman Empire faced the same pressures, made different choices, and survived. Constantinople maintained its currency, kept the gold solidus stable for 700 years, recruited its military from citizens, not mercenaries, invested relentlessly in infrastructure, walls, aqueducts, harbors, reformed its tax system to prevent wealth concentration, and maintained a government capable of making hard decisions. Byzantium lasted until 1453, 1,000 years after the West fell. Byzantium survived because it watched Rome make every mistake in the book and did the opposite. The pattern can be broken, but only if you recognize you're in it. The question this raises, the one we'll answer next, is why societies that can see the pattern still can't escape it. Why reform becomes impossible even when everyone agrees it's necessary. Next time, Emperor Majorian, the one guy who actually understood what was happening, who had a real plan to fix it, and who came within inches of pulling it off, and why his own Senate had him assassinated for trying. That's next. From Ashes to Insights.